Welcome back to the channel, you curd nerds. Uh, so we've got somebody coming on with us today, not a mock check ride, believe it or not. You want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, for sure. Hi, my name's Kora, and I'm an aviation therapist. So we'll leave it at that.
Yeah, we can definitely see the complex nature of an aviation therapist, given the well, what the FAA writes on paper and what happens can be a little contentious, right? I'm just gonna straight up admit I used to be an advocate for the FAA's mental health stance, because when you read it on paper, it seems incredibly reasonable. It's like, hey, let's you say you need some health care, go get the health care. We'll get you back to work in 6 months. All right, which I know 6 months, it's a little difficult taking time off of work for 6 months, but it's a whole lot better than what we actually see. Um, so before we get into all of that, as pilots, we obviously know it's somewhat of a stressful job, right? Even though some people say, oh, whatever, you're sitting in cruise for 6 hours. How stressful can that really be? We're not talking about just airline pilots. There's flight instructors, there's DPEs, there's test pilots, for the love of God. There's people out there. So as a mental health care professional, do you have some advice for pilots to make sure that they can keep up on their mental health before it gets to the point in which we need a professional involved?
Yeah, for sure. So, first things first, there are things that you can do on like a daily basis. I highly recommend practicing these skills before you're, triggered or really stressed out, because the likelihood of like mastering a new skill while you're really stressed is pretty low. So some things that you can kind of do on like what we call like a maintenance basis. First of all, I mean, out here in Oregon, it's finally starting to not pour rain every day. So as the sun keeps coming out, a really good place to start for folks is going on walks. That's always a good idea. But if you go on a walk actually during a specific time between 9 and 11 a.m. is kind of like that sweet spot for where the light hits through your eyeballs into your brain, that you actually get the most benefit out of those walks. So that's definitely one you can do. Walking's free. So
Walking definitely is free, and I mean, I know, as an airline pilot on some overnights, you could be stuck somewhere for 30 hours with literally nothing to do, right? Go explore another city. Obviously, that's beneficial to not just mental health, but I mean, you get to learn some new things. I know when I was out there flying, when I didn't, have this whole medical nonsense, I did my best to make sure that I could stop at like every art district or place where there was murals. Some people might call them graffiti. Uh, to just try and see what else was out there, right? And that's kind of why we all became pilots at the end of the day, right? We wanted to go see the world. We wanted that level of freedom. What else do you
yeah.
got in the way of recommendations?
Yeah, for sure. So, I like to tell clients that I work with, kind of creating like a menu, so to speak, of things that you like. As pilots, y'all have like this skill built up of, taking the world around you and then making like real-time decisions, when you're flying based on what you're seeing or, hearing, feeling. So, what I encourage folks when they're kind of like doing okay is to make essentially menus of things that they like to do when like their life is going like pretty average, especially focusing on things that involve like our senses. So I always tell folks an easy one is like if you like candy, throw some like Jolly Ranchers in your bag or Starbursts, anything that has like a different kind of flavor. So when you start to feel yourself kind of getting like stressed out in the moment, that's a really good way to like ground your brain, to remind yourself that you're still safe. Same goes with like ice water too, when we're really talking about calming down our nervous system in the moment. So these are things you can do just to practice and get in the habit. But then I really encourage folks to go to these when they are, activated, triggered, whatever synonym you want to use, for stress, distress. Uh, and then again, going back to your five senses, taste is one that we talked about. Any kind of music that you like, I recommend not listening to music that makes you angry, but anything that kind of like brings you down. I really like, shout out to like Captain Roger Victor. When I'm stressed, I will like pull up, just shuffle the videos and just kind of watch that. So yeah, there's that. Another one too, if you're kind of in the moment and you're like, I don't want to be stressed out about this later. Say something happens and need to act quick. One of the best things you can do if you're by yourself is actually play Tetris. And that kind of goes back to that, bringing in your senses because you're critically thinking and then you're combining critically thinking with like moving your hand to like move the little pieces. So that can be one. And then I'll finally end in terms of like what to do when you're kind of triggered with this is the biggest difference that kind of determines folks walking away with long-term impacts from a stressful situation is actually social support. And I do want to talk about that the social support when the researchers were doing their research for this, they found that even good social support regardless of the topic. So what they found was even if you didn't talk about what was stressing you out or what was putting you in distress, if you were just around good company, you'd actually have a lessening of your symptoms of stress, distress, and post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay, so what you're kind of saying at the end is that even if you're not specifically going to talk about the stressful experience in your life, um, if you've got a group of friends that you play video games with, preferably something that's not necessarily stress inducing, but
Yeah, yeah,
I
there is
love
that
Stardew
fine
Valley,
line.
right?
Yeah, yeah,
Stardew Valley is a perfect, to play with friends and just talk about nothing, right?
yeah.
Um, which is great, because again, as pilots, it can be a little isolating, especially, we've all had that crew member that we don't really get along with. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
um,
5 day trips too. It's always the 5 days.
I know. Oh, some of the, we can talk about that later.
Yeah, putting a
Um,
pin in
yeah, it's
that.
like let's put a um but having some kind of social structure in place. I know I'm in a bunch of Snapchat groups with a bunch of other pilots that we're all kind of on the same, wavelength of, these are the things we enjoy. Um, but definitely stay out of the groups that are, the Debbie Downers and negative Nancy's and all that jazz, right? We've all worked in places where, half of the people there just complain about how bad the job is, and then you kind of join in with it, right? Misery
Yeah.
loves company.
Yeah. Yeah, so there is actually science to show that like there is a certain point when you're venting that once you cross that it actually becomes like worse for you. And so to kind of build off of what you're saying, if you're like am I processing or am I venting? If you're really stuck on a topic because I know sometimes we can get in what we call, fixated on something and we want to shake it but we can't. So a way to kind of bring yourself back is like ask what the lesson is to learn. Like if we did something embarrassing, for example, us as humans, we really like cling on to that. And sometimes we, hyper fixate on those things. So if you're finding yourself and you can't like shake something, kind of ask yourself, like, okay, what did I learn in this situation? Because back in the day, our mistakes came with bigger consequences. So if we lived in a cave and we didn't close the door, some hyenas, came and ate our food and our fire went out. If we didn't constantly remind ourselves of that in the same way that we hyper fixate on, our mistakes now, which are like, oh my God, I can't believe I said that thing or whatever. Back in the day, if we didn't have those constantly at the front of our brains, like we would die. And so if you're wondering, why do I hyperfixate on these things? It's because back in the day, we had to like learn. And so if you're in that constant loop, I really encourage you to like take a step back and say like, what is my brain trying to teach me here? And then kind of
Mhm.
like build off from there to kind of step out of that loop. So that can also be really helpful too. If maybe you don't have friends around or you don't feel comfortable sharing, just be like, okay, what does my brain not want me to do again here? So yeah.
All right. So kind of recap it. Um, Venting, it's helpful, right?
Yeah.
Talking about stressful parts of your day, talking about things that went wrong, talking about, let's use a what seems like a really simple example that we all have experienced before. TSA says have a nice flight, and you respond, you too. All right. We all are like, wait a minute, why did I tell TSA to enjoy my flight? What? All right. So if you notice that you keep fixating on like going back to why did I say that? Why did I say that? Why did I say that? take a step back and go, what am I trying to teach myself by fixating on this one topic or this one line of questioning, this one statement, this one act? And if you, and purely to just identify what the learning objective was, accept that learning objective and move on.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a point in venting where like you can talk yourself into being more upset if you don't catch, that venting. And so if you're on the receiving end, if you're a friend listening or a colleague, kind of when you start to hear, repeats or kind of same themes coming up, that's when you can kind of redirect it and kind of move in a different direction. Because in, maybe you've heard like downward spirals before. We can definitely think our way into that. So if you're kind of listening, be like, hey, let's like take a pause. I think also too, we're a lot more critical on ourselves than other people. So what I like to recommend to folks is if you can, remove yourself by 1 degree from whatever the situation is.
Mm-hmm.
Y'all are taught, CRM from like a very early age. So I know we have probably a lot of folks that did the CFI route and had students, trying to kill them on a daily basis. So, learning what like the lesson is from there and applying it. But point is that we're going to be a lot nicer to students and our best friends and our family if they make a mistake. And so if you can kind of remove yourself 1 degree of like, if my best friend came to me and told me this, or if my student did this while we were, flying across country together, how would I respond? We're usually a lot meaner to ourselves in those situations than we would be to a student, crew, or friend or family. So to kind of ask that can be really helpful as well.
All right. Kind of put yourself in someone else's shoes in response to your situation, right? Put yourself on the
Yeah.
outside.
Yeah,
Um,
sometimes we can be our biggest bullies to ourselves. And we never talk like that to people we care about. So
exactly. Exactly. I know I've been a little rough to some students, but
they probably deserved it. I mean,
yeah.
there are some very special, like,
Yes, yes.
yeah,
Some but now I know at least when I was an airline pilot, there was definitely some times where kind of turned into flight deck therapy, especially on some longer legs. The captain going through some, the amount of times I heard a captain going through a divorce or their kid is sick. Do you
yeah.
have any recommendations for the outside, the crew member that might be the one that's getting vented to?
Yeah, for sure. So if you're, sitting there kind of like jump seat therapy or, flight deck therapy, just to kind of listen. I know as simple as it sounds, and this can apply to like, CRM and then just at home, sometimes just asking like, do you want me to just listen or do you want like to come up with like a plan or a solution? Because for some people, just listening is going to be the solution. And so I found like that to work really well. Is like if you don't know what they want, just ask, because then that saves a lot of energy of guessing, and that energy can be put into like helping the person. But yeah, that can be good because sometimes people get frustrated if you're like, oh, well, have you tried doing this, this, and this? And it's like, I just wanted to vent. Like I'm not there yet.
Yeah.
So yeah, just asking like, do you want me to listen or do you want to come up with a game plan for this? And then they can kind of, decide.
And on that same note, I know it's somewhat of a touchy subject, but if you are on the receiving end of that, flight deck therapy, at what point would you find it concerning and maybe somebody else, another party needs to be involved? Because, some of the stuff does get heavy, and I'm not going to try and call out any specific stories because, everybody's got their own unique experience.
Yeah, yeah. So, generally, when as someone that listens to many pilots talk, when I start to get worried is when you try to, maybe redirect the situation, and especially when you're out with, crews, y'all, if you have more than, min rest, you can go places, and if they're bringing up the same themes and you hear it in the flight deck, you hear it at the gate, and then maybe now you're at like Applebee's for margaritas and it's still coming up, then that's kind of when we start to get worried. I think a lot of pilots, I've worked with some that have been, like, I'm gonna pull myself out because I need to like get myself together. I think we should recognize more that like people are capable of doing that. But if we're crew, if we can't change the subject, also substances can be a really good indication of, I guess, someone's situation of like how they cope with things. In general, if I have a client that they're like, sometimes when I'm stressed, I will have, a nice IPA. That's awesome. But we start to get really concerned when that's the only tool you have to like calm you down or to process things. I like to tell folks, you know, if you can have at least 5 to 10 things and a cold glass of beer is one of those and you're using it equally as the other ones, then I'm not going to worry. But if that's the only thing you keep coming back to, then that's when I'm going to be like, hey, we should talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, and it seems like that is a lot of, I mean, I've tried to look for stats on this when it comes to alcoholism versus pilots, versus or alcoholism in pilots versus the general population. Um, but it's difficult to track down statistics on it because of the unwillingness of pilots to purely disclose that information. Um,
Yeah.
so how do you what are some of the signs that you would look for as a crew member before you might say something to them?
Yeah, for sure. So, I might want to know a little bit of like what they have like future plan. Like if they're in a really bad mood, but they're like, yeah, but I'm going to Jamaica, in 2 months or a month from now, then it's like, okay, like they still, see what we call like anchoring in a tomorrow, so to speak.
Okay.
So you're talking to someone and they're still, they're really miserable, but they're still making future plans. That can be something when people kind of go into what we call, am I allowed to curse on this? The
Just
the fuck
fucking
the
send it.
buckets. Yeah. When people go through the buckets or the clinical or psychological term is like nihilism, we start to get worried when people feel like nothing matters. And what's the point or why bother? That's kind of when I start to worry about like, hey, like let's talk about why, or like this is why we bother. So just, what we call the fuckets, nihilism is going to be one. Um, so those are the two biggest ones. Rest is interesting because I know for some pilots they go and like that's their adventure, but I know other pilots that have 5 kids at home and maybe a part-time job, and so slam clicking is how they recharge. But in general, just lack of future foresight, drugs and alcohol. I know y'all are a little bit limited with the drugs part, but alcohol, if they're sweating vodka in the morning, that might also be a sign that they're coping to stress. Because basically, us as humans, we all have what we call eustress, and that's like a fancy word to say everyone has the perfect amount of stress to where we can accomplish things while still like feeling like we need to do stuff. And so when people are in distress, again, what's the point? Having trouble with, basic hygiene stuff. I guess I'd also say if the crew isn't in the van in the morning, we've seen some stories circulate recently. So just really checking in, exchanging contact information or grabbing it from the crew scheduling app and just calling in for each other. I mean, worst case, it's like, I spilled coffee on my uniform and I'm changing, but worst case is like, hey, I'm having trouble getting out of bed or they're not answering. So that would be another one too, is, not showing up for van time.
Okay, okay. Now, to change a little bit of gears, when a pilot is in that level of distress and they recognize it, I mean, I could even use my, one of my situations, for example. I ended up in an aircraft, an airplane crash. I was, it was scary, right? Engine failed at 80 feet. I took 2 weeks off. Um, that's a normal event. That is a normal response to that. But as a pilot, like if I went to go talk to somebody about that in a professional aspect, that would be genuinely jeopardizing to my career. So, what are your recommendations?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess it's kind of twofold of how, I've approached it as a mental health professional and then what y'all can do. So first of all, the big ticket items for y'all, from what I've understood with like the Med Express and reporting to your AME, is, diagnoses are a big no-go, and then also, reporting medical professional visits. So the way I, as a clinical provider, so to speak, have kind of categorized these things as consults, life coaching. In general, we're going to steer away from any kind of like diagnostic stuff. One of the first things I like to tell my clients is like, I'm like the Home Depot. Tell me what you want to work on. And I'll be like, come this way. And if you don't like, the skills we teach, something I really focus on versus, diagnostic stuff is skill building. So it's like, all right, try these. And if you hate it, it's okay. Cause I got like 3 more aisles full of, lamps or, whatever. So finding someone, which leads to, I acknowledge that people in aviation is such an interesting industry, because you have like sheer like poverty level to like sitting decent, like mainline captains not doing too bad. And
Nah,
so I
not too
acknowledge
shabby.
that this next recommendation does exclude folks that can't afford it. So I personally make my price points like entry, like anyone can afford it. I have CFI pricing, which is half of like what normal people pay. But if you are like, she's cool, but I don't know if she's for me, go to your local like therapist, psychologist. And unfortunately for us on our end, if I see you and I bill insurance, your session won't get paid for by insurance unless you have a diagnosis. And so if you are capable of paying out of pocket, that would be, one of the best things. And just explain to your mental health professional, therapist, counselor that, this is why I cannot get diagnosed. And most of them should have an option to pay out of pocket. I will say sometimes it can be steep. So again, like acknowledging that that does exclude, folks that can't afford it. And it might be helpful too if you're calling around asking, one, do you guys, take cash payments, not through insurance? And then two, asking, do you have anyone on staff trained to work with folks in aviation? Because at the end of the day, you're not going to buy a pair of shoes that doesn't fit. So, when you're looking for someone to work with, asking, do you know someone, that is aware of the aviation industry, or, works with like people, who are Hispanic or LGBTQ, or in the same way that you'd ask about other things, just kind of ask about that. Because you never know, there might be someone at a practice that's like, oh, they're dating a pilot, or, they're married to a pilot. So just asking. But my personal approach is like, it's life coaching. So yeah,
And it's frustrating that we have to do that, because
it
it
is.
seems, because again, there are countless veterans out there that half the reason they joined the military was to get health care.
Yep.
But it is absolutely impossible to go to a VA doctor without a diagnosis.
Yep.
And that's what we're hoping for change, is that, a diagnosis isn't a death to your career. Um, so we've talked about all the tools that you can use until it gets to the point where you need care. We talked about how you can, try and get the care that you need, for lack of a better term, in a way to circumvent the system that's currently in place. But I know this might be kind of putting you on the spot a little bit, but what's your, as a mental health care provider, and, if you're not comfortable answering the question, I know, the FAA can be a little
Oh,
much
let's hear it.
sometimes.
Yeah, let's hear
Yeah.
it.
Um, what's your opinion as a mental health care professional from what you see in regards to the FAA's stance on mental health care?
So happy you asked. Thank you. Because you brought up like when you went over it, and I felt differently when I went over it. So let me tell you how I feel about it. So I am pretty lucky. When I first started this whole thing, I ended up taking a policy class for my master's program, and they're like, you can pick any policy you want. Spent a whole semester basically going through the mental health policy for the FAA, like with a fine tooth comb. And I was actually like pretty appalled as a mental health professional. I kind of remember the defining moment where I was like, this isn't making a connection. And it was the FAA's stance on mood disorders. So, quick and dirty of it, a mood disorder is a feeling or an emotion that you have been going through for more than 3 months. And so that is a disqualifying diagnosis. And here, living in the Pacific Northwest, where everyone and their cousin goes through SAD, seasonal affective disorder, that's technically a mood disorder. And that's where I was like, wait a minute. Like,
Mhm.
are we disqualifying all the people in like Seattle and Portland and, places where it's natural, like part of the cycle of living somewhere north. So that was kind of where I was like, ooh, I don't know about this. And then, after being now in business and working with folks who have gone through this, I'm coming up on my 4th year doing this. So like data collection wise, not too bad. The
You got some
average
pretty good data points.
yeah, I'm like, I feel good about it. We could talk about it now. Most folks are waiting 6 months to a year to hear back. I did a poll recently, and over 50% of people have said they have, basically been in mail tag of, sending letters and trying to hear back for on average over a year, is kind of what my poll came out to, with 50% of people that, and again, it's Instagram, so like caveat as a researcher, I'm not saying this poll is law and all those things, because I know there's probably like researchers listening, or people in
If there are researchers
academia.
watching my YouTube channel,
Hello, any
uh,
academics that are listening to your YouTube channel. Just want to point out that Instagram is not the best data collection tool, but it did really put out when, more than 200 people come out and say, like, this has been my experience. I've worked to now where I've had clients, working with me for a couple years. And the few that I have, they've been sitting at about 9 months. The people that I've been working with have just sitting. On one occasion, I had somebody who the FAA made a clerical error, and this person had proof to be like, that's like the wrong person. You are assigning this to the wrong person. Just to get that clerical error fixed was 3 months, and that person couldn't fly. They were at home, which obviously brought on a bunch of stress, and that is for someone at no fault. And it still took that long.
and it seems insane that like for lack of a better term to use, um, that somebody would be grounded, put out of work for 3 months over a clerical error.
Yes.
With appropriate documentation showing like, hey, y'all made a mistake. I know I watched that NTSB hearing, and there was an FAA safety inspector that was like, "You're asking me for VA records. I'm not a veteran." And I'm like, wait a minute. Somebody from inside, like, y'all can't even keep your own employees straight, which,
Yeah.
I know, again, not as a mental health care provider, I'm purely a pilot. It just feels like I hate to say this because, CAMI is aware of, the Civil Aeronautical Medical Institute, CAMI is, they've already said they watch my content. But it
Yeah.
almost feels as though CAMI isn't, whether it be a staffing problem or whether it be an actual qualification problem, it almost feels as if they're not up to the job, that
Yeah.
it should be up to the healthcare provider. Because, like if we compare mental health to, like, let's say a broken bone, right? Or again, let's use me for an example. I crashed my motorcycle doing 75 miles an hour and broke 6 transverse processes on my back. There was no follow-up. It was, are you okay? Yeah. That was the end of the conversation. And I'm like, it doesn't make any sense how you can trust my healthcare provider when it comes to like pretty substantial injuries.
Physical trauma.
But when it comes to like a pilot saying, hey, I was scared in war, no, you can't work for over a year.
Yeah.
So I just,
And you bring up a really good point too, which is, when people ask like, well, what change would you like to see? And it's kind of like, trust us as providers. I mean, there have been some clients where I'm like, how do you feel about like not touching an airplane for a little bit while we figure this out? Like that's no different than if I'm talking to a doctor and they're telling me, that they're not fit for surgery. I'm gonna be like, maybe let's not do surgery for a little bit. So it is kind of, you know, um, kind of an FU to not only us as like licensed professional mental health people, but y'all as licensed professional pilots who, by all accounts and standards, we've passed these benchmarks that say we're capable of making decisions. And then, the benchmarks somehow go away when it comes to the FAA in terms of our, licensure and y'all's licensure or, certifications to fly. So I'd say one of the biggest things, I'd ask for is just, trust the people doing the stuff on the ground, both mental health providers and pilots is kind of the ultimate thing. Is it's not easy to become either one of those, and we're all in a position where none of us, hopefully want to jeopardize that. So
And I know everyone, I know countless people like to bring up the Germanwings 9525 incident. And the part that so many people gloss over is that his mental health care provider told him to not go to work,
yeah,
told him he wasn't currently fit to operate an aircraft. And he chose to not disclose that information. So
yeah,
it's almost like if we were to trust the healthcare provider, this incident could have been prevented.
yeah, yeah,
And
for
I
sure.
understand it's not the FAA, it's a different country, but
Yeah,
I get that.
yeah,
But when it's trying to be used as an example of why we have our aeromedical system, well, let's use it as an example in our aeromedical system. Now, what's your again, as a mental health care provider, what's your opinion on the requirement of things like neurocog and neuropsych evaluations? I don't know if you've seen that neurocog evaluation, but it's daunting.
yeah. Yeah, so it's funny actually when I found out, I think the one Delta does, is similar when I have folks come in, I have them do something similar when they're not like pilots, just in terms of, so I thought that was very interesting. I was like, wait, that's the same thing we do, at our office, when we have an incoming person. But you actually bring up a really good point, which is um, the oh my gosh, I just lost it. I'm so sorry.
No, no. Uh,
When when people come in and oh, I remember. Okay. So when say that you get diagnosed and then you're in kind of like that purgatory of waiting, I think there's definitely a discrepancy on how many certified like psychologists there are, which I think is like a huge clog in terms of folks getting access to those neuropsych evals that get them back on the flight line. And what a lot of people don't realize is that those come out of pocket and often cost thousands of dollars. We have someone that does them in on the forensic side, not for pilots, and it's like 3 to 5 grand for these neuropsych evaluations if you do get flagged in by the FAA and you got to prove that you're safe and you're not a danger in the flight deck. Hopefully you have 3 to 5 thousand grand laying around while you're unemployed. So
believe me, I got the no or I have to go do that neurocog eval. Um and it's 3 grand if I pay cash, 3250 if I use a card. I'm like, that doesn't sound shady. But
yeah,
what am I gonna do? Like the other option is I'm done being a pilot. And
yeah.
I know the FAA is really proud of their only 0.1% get a final denial when it comes to the aeromedical reform. Um, Now you said you did a bunch of research on the FAA's, on their stance, on their laws, on their regulations, right? Have you been able to track down any data backing up that point? Because I haven't.
I haven't. And it's really interesting because you bring up a good point of like, if that is totally true, if that's like the new thing, I think it's really unrealistic to one, expect people to believe that that's the thing, but then two, like they've done a huge amount of historical damage and trauma to folks that have gone through their system. If that is true, it comes off as very blind to the damage that they've done up to this point. If they're like, oh, well, now this is all, all we have. Well, the people that have been impacted are not just going to like wake up and forget, that they saw their buddies lose their license or they had to go through, you know, um, the purgatory. I think also maybe people just get like tired and give up after waiting for like 6 to 9 months, and maybe they're like, it's not worth it. So I haven't been able to find anything. I will say I've tried reaching out to the FAA through my state representative. Shout out to Oregon. No one's gotten back to me. So that's been also kind of telling of how inaccessible these people are in terms of, any kind of community mental health, anything. If the people that are making the rules are not accessible to the people their rules are impacting, then that is already like a huge red flag. And then that the journey I've gone through my state representatives and Congress people out here has really just shown how hard they try to be inaccessible.
And it's frustrating because you see them making Instagram videos and whatnot. And I'm like, all I've tried to do is get your data.
Yeah.
Like you as a professional saying, hey, I just want the data that you have so that I can use it as a tool to adjust my course of action.
Yeah.
And I can't even get that data. And again, since I haven't been able to track it down, and anecdotally, it sure seems like a whole lot more than 0.1% of pilots give up on their
Yeah.
medical journey. Because if we look at it, I think I did the math. It was like 1,690 people would be that 0.1%. 1,690 people receive a final denial. And I'm like, I've
That's
got
not nothing.
videos with, I've got videos with more likes than that, agreeing that
Yeah.
we need aeromedical reform, and so many anecdotal stories. You see things like, the Pilots Pandemic Podcast petition with over 14,000 signatures of stories of people, either their family members going through it or them going through it. I'm like, that's a whole lot more than 1,690 people
That's
that
a
have
small
been,
town or a large arena, 14,000,
so it's just, I would really love if we could get the data to have a conversation, because if we can't even disclose where this information is coming from, it feels like, how do we move forward with a level of trust? Because I know that's what the FAA is saying when they show up to the NTSB hearings, when they talk it, on Instagram. They want to build a level of trust, and I would love to do that. But when we can't, when even mental health providers trying to do research about this exact subject can't get the data from the FAA, I, I'm
Yeah.
not sure where the next step is.
No, I mean, I'm kind of there, I'm with you in terms of I kind of when I reached out to my state representatives, I thought that was kind of like my ace in the hole to you sound like a dad there. But even they were like, this is really weird. We're not hearing back from like these people that we're reaching out to. We're not hearing back from them. There was a time after the Alaska Air incident with that pilot where they were reaching out to maybe talk to people. I was disqualified for not having a PhD. So
Oh,
yeah, sorry,
shenanigans.
only 7 years in the field and a few hundred clients, but no, I don't have the PhD, so nothing I have is of value clearly to the FAA.
Now, I do have to ask, because anecdotally on the pilot side, um, the amount of people that have taken the neurocog and have responded with, it doesn't feel like this is accurate or effective at testing what it's testing for. Because, I have to go do it. And when I read the paperwork, it says it's intended for people who've taken medication that impacts their faculties, concussions, multiple sclerosis, or my favorite part, etc.
Yeah,
I have none of the stated things, but I guess I have etc.
everyone could have etc. when you think about it.
And that's a frustrating part. But like, again, from a mental health care professional, what's your opinion on the validity of a neurocog evaluation for things beyond for the etc.?
Yeah, I think, if that's the only basis you're using to make these determinations, then I'm not going to recommend even the best ones. It should never be the only thing. So in general, we start to get worried when things are kind of held up on any kind of pedestal, because even the best psych tool, the best intervention is only going to, work for a certain number of people. And so I think there should be maybe some alternatives to that, especially like asking how often is it getting revised? That's something that I don't know. And now I'm talking about it. I should think about or look into, how often these things get revised because in, mental health, even 5 years can really change, how we approach different, situations. And so alone by itself, obviously you should never focus on just one thing, but if it is that one thing, you best be like checking receipts and updating and making sure that it is, up to standards because even our own diagnostic manual, things change every edition that comes out. And so to have things stay not changing while the rest of society is changing, that's when we start to get concerned. So part of me is like, it should never be one thing, and the second part is I'm very curious as to how often they update that tool.
Now, I'm going to reach out on a limb and I'm going to quote Ramos Law.
Ooh,
Um,
okay.
they're saying the FAA is still using the DSM-3. Now, again, I can't guarantee that. I can't like prove that. That is from Ramos Law.
Yeah.
Um, they are like the renowned mental health lawyer. That's such a weird thing to say, a mental health lawyer. Feels like we shouldn't need mental health, but either way,
Yeah.
they're like the renowned aviation mental health lawyer that have dealt with countless cases about, alcoholism, substance abuse, mental health, etc. So they seem pretty well versed.
Yeah.
And to put a little bit of context to that, the DSM-3, if I'm correct, still views homosexuality as a psychosexual illness.
Yeah, so if you're listening and you're like, "What are these letters?" The DSM is basically our manual that helps us diagnose people, and we're on DSM-5 TR right now. So the fact that they're on 3 just like baffles me. I mean, even if we're on like 5, they're like, "But do you have their revised edition?" And so, wow. I mean, if that is true, yeah, there's been a lot that changes, and these diagnostic manuals aren't things that come out every year, so they have been sitting on that for quite a long time. And there's definitely some antiquated terms in there that we just simply don't use because it's harmful to our clients.
I mean, and incorrect.
Yeah,
Like if I went to a therapist or a psychiatrist, psychologist, and they were using the DSM-3 to diagnose and treat me, that would be, I mean, I feel like that would be grounds for a malpractice suit.
yeah, that is great. Like I have the DSM-5 and I'm like so embarrassed because I'm like, I don't have the TR, like no one look. um, so yeah, that is I if that is true, that is very appalling. I would personally lend them my DSM-5. Personally lend them if that is
Well,
what it takes to
I'm sure they'd get back to you in the mail in about 6 to 9 months.
yeah.
Um, I'm not trying to make light of somewhat of a rough situation for a lot of people, um, because when they see things like this, it it deters people from healthcare. I know there was a new influencer with 1.7 million followers on YouTube that today dropped a video bashing Ramos Law, saying we can't let mentally unfit pilots fly. Um,
Ooh, spicy.
yeah, it was a little rough, but he kept holding up the same kind of old ideology, and it's kind of scary because the pilots who have the ideology that therapy, like, to put it bluntly, that therapy means that you want to suck start a shotgun, are the ones that are scary because they're going to be the ones that refuse to get the care.
Mhm.
They're going to be the over 50% that refuse to get care and still operate an aircraft, even though they're suffering from symptoms in which they should be receiving care for. And that's not just me pulling out random statistics. You can find this. The University of North Dakota did a study, and the Air Force funded a study and found that in every situation, over 50% of pilots avoided healthcare when they needed it and either or got healthcare and lied about it.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
And
and it definitely, I think, drives people to try to feel better from things and people and places that they shouldn't. Going back to drugs and alcohol, that's one way. Also, you brought up a really good point of like The internet, it's a crazy and chaotic place, and unfortunately, people use it to like take advantage of other people. And it really pushes folks to kind of go to what's accessible, and sometimes what's accessible isn't necessarily what's ethical or, the best protocol for the situation.
Mhm. I know I've gotten people asking me in a few of my comments, like, is things like BetterHelp appropriate for pilots? And I've also heard horror stories of people going to things like BetterHelp and getting, diagnosed with ADHD and getting prescribed like off the wall stimulants that should not be used for this person because they didn't.
BetterHelp was sending their information to Meta, and there was just recently a really big lawsuit. So if you're listening, I highly recommend not using BetterHelp, because basically they took all the notes and information from the sessions that therapists were typing and then sold it to Meta to like advertise to people on Facebook. So don't do BetterHelp.
Oh,
Uh, yeah, putting a pin in that. Yeah, that was something that kind of sent waves in the mental health community at the time. So.
I mean that waves seems like an understatement.
Yeah.
That's that seems like a blatant violation of, sure, there was probably some paperwork in some terms of service that was 9,000 pages long that told people that they agreed to it. And it's like, come
Yeah.
on, like let's like informed consent does not mean that you hit it on page 8,701 of a 9,000 page document.
Yeah.
Um, so I know you kind of brought it up, but to just kind of close up, what are you hoping to see? Because I know Pilot's mental health campaign, they're doing things to try and help the aeromedical reform. March 12th, they had a lobbying meeting. I know I was there. I talked to over 5 different elected official staffers to try and get
Nice.
the point across. One of the people in my group, they spent 18 months working on their deferral because of a medication they've been on since they were 10 with no side effects. They're
Yeah.
18 now.
Yep.
And they refuse to take topical topical acne cream because it would have complicated their, the current system is making it so people can't take acne cream.
Yep.
So what are you hoping to see with things like this, with people trying to advocate for reform? What would be the perfect system?
I think it all starts with accessibility to the people that make the rules. It is unfortunate that the only time, there are these public meetings is when something goes terribly wrong. I think that should be, almost a monthly thing, like roundtable. It's hear from the public. So in terms of like accessibility, that's going to be number one. Accessibility to also the people who like do the psych evals that are needed to like get cleared for flying. I think there's, not very many. So even if the FAA doesn't take, 6 to 9 months, getting on the books of those people that are qualified by the FAA can also take several months too. So if you're one of the lucky ones in one end, you could get boned in the other. I think also reaching out to, mental health professionals. I constantly get folks in mental health that are like, "Are you sure? Like that's the craziest rule." So teaching us of, hey, these are a group of people that might have these concerns in the same way that we work, with like police officers or other folks that are specially trained. I'm having trouble finding specific training. I'd like to start when I graduate this June to kind of start, reaching out to other mental health professionals and just being like, hey, if you have someone with a, medical, this is kind of how to approach it. So making the price accessible, making the people accessible, making information for us as providers accessible. So even if, you're not specializing in pilot, maybe there's a hub you can go that says like, hey, these are common occurrences within the aviation industry that you can look out for. That's kind of, a resource hub for folks, both the pilots and the providers. But again, if I had one word, it would just be accessibility, time, money, outreach.
I, I mean, if that isn't exactly what so many people have wanted. I know
Yeah.
I've talked to so many people where even their doctors are getting frustrated, going like, "Why can't I just call this person?"
Yeah.
Like when not on the mental health side, when you look at like Legal Dad's story on TikTok. I mean, the FAA diagnosed him with sleep apnea based on like a blood test from a year ago that showed not outside of the realm of, healthy, just on the top edge of healthy. And they were like,
Yeah.
you must have sleep apnea. And it's like, where?
Yeah.
And the doc and his primary care couldn't even talk to the guy, or the provider, the healthcare individual, the doctor in the FAA, to be like, hey, like we need to hash this out, because like what you're seeing isn't what I'm seeing, and I'm this guy's doctor.
Hmm.
So yes, accessibility would be
Yeah.
an amazing change. Um,
Definitely. Like maybe less time on the funny posts, because there are some good ones, but even if it's 1 hour a month where you have an open Zoom call, or like open a conference room in Washington DC for people to come. But they wait so long to have any kind of round table that by the time it comes, you have a bunch of people trying to go. So it's kind of like this supply and demand of, well, now we can't accommodate everybody that should be there because we have them so infrequently.
exact, and it's I know from the few times I've talked to people at FSDOs, is it seem flight safety director's office, the kind of like the local FAA, there seems to be a huge disconnect. Because I mean, I just got a call from my local FSDO for something entirely unrelated to my medical, well, mildly related to my medical, and the guy I talked to refuses to get a colonoscopy because he's a pilot, and terrified that like just a colonoscopy is going to put his medical at risk. And he's in the FAA. We have pilots terrified of routine medical care.
Hmm.
We need change.
Yeah, and that is medical care is a safety protocol. Accessible medical care is a safety protocol in the same way that we approach, going to the colonoscopy. If we have early intervention, then the likelihood of a catastrophic situation is going to be a lot less. And so if we get someone, say if they've gone through something within the first year, if they have access to care, their likelihood of like continuous PTSD or any kind of symptoms is going to be a lot less. So another thing too, just kind of wrapping up in terms of like, yeah, this is really bad. In the same way that positive interactions after a traumatic event can sway folks from getting PTSD, there's this thing called moral injury, that basically if you go through something traumatic and then the people in authority of power or people you trust basically give you the middle finger and are not supportive, which I think you're seeing with a lot of pilots either avoiding or they're going through, then that actually is one of the biggest determinants to get PTSD. And so, how the FAA is responding to something potentially minor could exacerbate the symptoms to where it's a whole new diagnosis, which is even worse.
Believe me, the messages I've received of people like their entire careers being over for routine care
Yep.
is insane. So you said you want to start building maybe like a network or some kind of training hub, to help other mental health care providers. I don't, if you want me to cut this out at the end, we
No, you
can.
can go for
um,
it.
is there a way people can contact you to try and join in on
Yeah,
this
for sure.
coalition of or hub to help pilots gain access to care?
Yeah, so first thing, the like basic way is Instagram. So my Instagram handle is aviation.therapist. I also have a website, which is flightdeckcommunity.com. Like everybody, it's kind of like I was like, oh, all hands on deck. We need everybody. It's kind of inconspicuous. It's not like I need pilottherapy.com. So flight deck community is a really good place to contact me. I was really original with my email. So if email works, flightdeckcommunity@gmail.com is another direct way to get in contact with me.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to talk to me about this, and talk to all 870 followers on YouTube and the 120 something thousand elsewhere. Um, we really do appreciate it. We appreciate it that other mental health care providers outside of aviation are trying to get in and be like, hey, look, like outside looking in, this looks rough. I want to help.
Oh yeah, I should mention I live with a pilot. So
Oh,
that's,
well,
I
okay.
guess, so yeah, I guess I should have started with that. But there you go.
Well, still, you're not an AME, you're not
Yeah,
a HIMSS AME, you're not a HIMSS psychiatrist. You are, you know, a non-FAA approved doc that's saying, "Hey, I'm a doc on the outside going, we need some reform.
yeah.
We need something different." Because it's scary to think that, again, over 50% of pilots are avoiding care when they need it.
And then you think about like there are 50% of pilots that admit avoiding when they need it. And then you got the other ones that,
There's some people that say that, it's 100%. 100%
yeah.
of pilots avoid healthcare even though they need it. Um, because again, it's routine. The current system has routine care putting pilots' entire careers at jeopardy. And I'm not ever saying that we need to get rid of the aeromedical standards, but as you said earlier, trust the doctors that are treating the pilots.
Hmm.
So
And trust the pilots too. I mean, y'all work so hard to get to where you are. It just baffles me that, people are like, "Oh yeah, they would throw that away," or, trust the people that have put the sweat equity to get to that position.
believe me, I what, 7, 8 years of work to now, sit here 408 days out of work is
Yeah.
definitely. But yeah, I appreciate it. I look forward to putting this out and seeing what people. Well, hopefully we get a lot of support and go to pilots mental or pmhc.org. It's a nonprofit that's really at Washington's doorstep to try and advocate for this reform. And definitely reach out to Kora if you're a mental health care provider that wants to, well, help, that wants to ensure that pilots have access to care, that wants to build that training hub so that everybody's on the same page when it comes to getting people the care that they need.